Hello, my name is Jerry Kang. I am a law professor at UCLA, and I'm delighted to have my esteemed guest, Professor Calvin Lai. I'm connected with the Critical Race Studies program here at UCLA School of Law. I was the founding co-director, and one of the great things about this program is that sometimes we have remarkable scholarly talent to join us for conversations such as this one. And let me spend just a minute introducing Professor Calvin Lai, and then we're going to have a really interesting conversation about what he knows best, implicit bias. Calvin is an assistant professor of psychological and brain sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. He has fancy degrees from fancy places, but he has had significant experience with Project Implicit, which is actually the ways that most of us understand and have tried out the implicit association test. Currently, he is the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board, and for 5 years he acted as the director of research. And he's been an extraordinarily productive scholar doing incredibly important work about implicit bias and how it actually might be reduced out in the real world. His work has been covered in obviously incredibly important scholarly journals, but also, has gotten a huge amount of public press in places like the Harvard Business Review, Vox, BBC, CNN, PBS. And I think we're really fortunate to have this really interesting conversation with Professor Lai. So Calvin, I'm going to call you Calvin. You can call me Jerry. I'm really glad that you're here. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, and I'm excited to be here to chat about, all things bias.
All things bias, all things bias. Hey, we're going to do this in a couple different acts. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Act 1 is just implicit bias 101. I know that everyone knows a lot about implicit bias. You can't, pick up a cup of coffee these days and not think about implicit bias. But it's lovely to be able to talk to an expert, and so we'll get some basics, but also probe in a little bit more deeply. That's Act number 1. Act number 2 is for people who want real solutions. And I think Calvin's research has really focused on what works and sometimes disappointingly what does not work. And we want to be, again, evidence-based in the ways we think about things and to be sort of honest with the science and the limited partial data and understanding that we ever have in any given moment. Part 3 will focus a little bit more specifically on policing, in part because Calvin has done some really interesting work on what it might take to reduce discrimination or bias within the policing context. So those are the 3 acts. Let's just roll into act number 1, implicit bias 101. Okay, Calvin, implicit bias. Ever know something about implicit bias? Bias, when I think about bias, like old school bias, I think of people who are like, and it doesn't have to be old school, I think about like hate crimes, like the murder of, Ahmaud Arbery, we think about lynchings, the Klan, like exclusion laws. Like most people think about bias in the feeling of like animus, hatred, don't want your people around me, that kind of thing, right? That's how I think I initially understood bias. But now there's this idea of implicit bias. So in what ways is the concept of implicit bias different from this kind of old school animus? Like, your people should never be around my people, I'm disgusted, I hate you, your tribe is not mine. In what ways is implicit bias meaningfully different from that old school conception of animus or prejudice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my mind, one of the big differences between implicit bias and explicit bias is that implicit biases often reflect things that are unstated, that are oftentimes unconscious or just dimly conscious, or that are thoughts or feelings that are kind of spontaneous, that feel kind of like that intrusive gut feeling that you have, or that thought that you can't quite shake. These kind of tacit assumptions that you might have about people because of the group that they belong to, that can still nonetheless influence how you act with them without you realizing. And that's what really kind of makes them quite different from the kind of old-fashioned racism that we often think about, right? Oftentimes it's not driven by this kind of extreme hate, but more from these kind of subtle assumptions or expectations we have for others and the ways that we enforce them.
Got it. So you said things like dimly understood, like dimly aware, that it's kind of subtle. But let's back up a little bit more. Even back in the day, like 25 years ago, most people were not talking about implicit bias. Like, yeah, I don't even know if you were alive 25 years ago. But like, again, so 25 years ago, most people are not talking about implicit bias. Maybe people talked about unconscious stuff a la Freud. But even 25 years ago or 50 years ago, we knew that there was something different between just a really hatred towards a group, like disgust at a group or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Never marry your kind, never date your kind, never want to live next to you or eat next to you. We understood that. But we also understood, I don't know, what might be called more statistical stereotyping. Like, on average, men are taller than women. Let's get even a little more dicey. On average, like, white guys are taller than Asian guys.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe it's true, maybe not, but on average, that's the right thing.
Yeah.
On average, like, men score higher on math tests than women, right? Those don't feel like anger and hatred. They're just averages. They're just generalizations. Is that explicit or implicit? That seems a little more subtle.
Right. So there are a couple of things that you're kind of drawing upon here that I think are really important for understanding the nature of bias and understanding the nature of prejudice. One is that there are these kind of statistical realities about what groups tend to do, and one of the things that we consistently find when we're looking at how people stereotype is that there might be a slight statistical difference that exists out there in the real world, but oftentimes when people are engaging in stereotyping, what they're doing is they're running a mile with what might just be an inch, right? There might be a slight difference in, for example, how assertive one group of people are and another group is, but we might think that instead of it being like this, just a little bit different, we think it's a lot different.
We exaggerate differences.
Yeah. And that's what often happens in terms of how people express some of these subtle biases, whether it be on race or gender, that they're taking these kind of stereotypes and running much further with them than would even be justified on statistical terms alone.
Got it. So we know that there are these things that feel much more like animus or prejudice or almost like hatred, right?
Yes.
We also know that there's these generalizations that, as you just helpfully pointed out, that we tend to exaggerate often, right? We tend to think, even if there's some differences or even if there's like overlapping spreads between them, we tend to think that they're sharply different and tend to exaggerate them. But that existed 50 years ago, right? Attitudes and stereotypes, right? Feelings and beliefs. But now we have a way to understand them as also being implicit, that there's things that are kind of invisible to us, right? And so does that mean both feelings or attitudes as well as kind of generalizations about who's good at what or who tends to have this kind of attribute? I want to think about right now, are there like implicit feelings as well as implicit kind of generalizations?
Yeah, and so a lot of times, we might have these kind of gut feelings that we can't quite shake, that we can't quite articulate. But like, for example, you might see a white job candidate, and for some reason just think that they have potential, that even though there's some yellow flags, they might be good for it. But when you see a similar candidate that is maybe black or Hispanic, you might think, oh, but
doubts or risky, or
right. The yellow flag turns into a red flag, and a lot of that is kind of driven by this feeling that like something's just not quite right. And so that's a lot of times what I mean by it being just dimly conscious, where it can invoke, race or some other protected class, but not in a way that you're totally aware that that's what you're using to make your judgment.
Got it. So it sounds like you're using the word implicit, the adjective of a bias. Bias could be, again, this kind of almost like hatred-like feeling or a generalization that you have of categories. It sounds like you're using implicit really to mean kind of dimly aware, like it almost kind of bubbles up almost automatically, but it's hard to get a good grip on it, although it doesn't sound like it's impossible necessarily.
Yeah, and I think some of the really strict tests by cognitive scientists and social psychologists that have tried to understand the essence of implicit bias is it's not like so unconscious that you could never be aware of it. A lot of times it's unconscious in the sense that we are not reflecting on it, right? Like we're not putting our flashlight on those parts of our thoughts. And so, we might have this kind of bad feeling about someone and we don't interrogate ourselves about where did that come from. Had we done so, we might have realized that you might be doing it for unjustifiable bias reasons. But, the nature of the world is that we make hundreds of impressions of of people and things every day, and we don't spend that much time reflecting on why we're doing it. And sometimes the reasons why might come from these kind of implicit biases or stereotypes.
Right, right. And it also might be, and tell me if you think this is also a possibility, that if, our general norms in politics have changed, right? What was politically correct 50 years ago is not what's politically correct now. And I mean that in all kinds of directions, both left, right, conservative, progressive, however you define it. And if the world tells you constantly that you should not actually hate different kinds of people simply because of the color of their skin or other kinds of stuff, then you might tell yourself, well, I shouldn't have those feelings. I shouldn't have those attitudes. I'm supposed to be about diversity and inclusion. And nevertheless, you still might have something deep inside that inclines you to favor some people you're familiar with versus people who seem a little different. And is it possible that that kind of dissociation between what society tells you, like be fair and square, treat everyone the same, don't generalize ever, but then we kind of have gut intuitions or experiences that incline us one direction or another. Might that be a reason why we don't let ourselves recognize kind of the junk in our hearts or in our brains?
Yeah. I think that a lot of times we see our values to be the end all be all of who we are, but a lot of times there are parts of ourselves that we don't like to admit to ourselves exist, right? Like,
yes. How many beers we drink on a day sometimes.
Yeah, or I want to be someone that exercises a lot, but at the end of the day, right, I might have these tendencies to really not want to do that. And I think a lot of us have these kind of high and mighty aspirations to be egalitarian, but a lot of times if we're not trying to check ourselves or being careful about what we say or consider other people's feelings, right, the initial tendency might be to do something that is prejudiced, to do something that's discriminatory, to do something that's not fair to others.
Got it. Okay, last question on this kind of idea about implicit bias. So, I know something about psychology, and there is this kind of debate between whether some feature, like maybe it's just extroversion or openness, whether that's a stable trait, a psychological trait of a person, or it's just a state that exists because of the environment, right? Some people talk about the fundamental attribution error. We tend to think that these are stable personality characteristics, generally speaking, but sometimes it might really just be the environment, right? So oftentimes people joke, is it trait or state? Is it person or situation? So when I think about, like, say, implicit biases, things that are kind of subtle, is it something that's really in my head, kind of stored, written down in the hard drive up here? Or is it, kind of stuff in the air, that if I have a lot of progressive people around me, I kind of tune to the progressive vibe. If I have a lot of, conservative folks around me, I tune to the conservative vibe. Is it trait or state as I think about implicit mental associations?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the kind of perennial debates when it comes to bias, but also just many other types of psychological concepts, right? Whether it be the nature of our personalities or stuff like that. I think there's a lot of kind of ongoing debate about exactly how we ought to characterize implicit biases. At least in the way my kind of read of the literature, it's kind of a little of both, and I think most folks would probably agree with that in the research literature. In the sense that, a lot of these implicit biases are picked up from kind of cultural exposure, from the kind of fabric of the experiences that we've had growing up, but that there's also a lot of room for personal agency in what is the type of cultural exposure that you get, right? What are the types of media that you watch? What are the types of cultural experiences that you select yourself into? Mm-hmm. There are choices of how much you stop yourself from saying the thing that's going to hurt other people, or make the types of choices that are going to be discriminatory, choices of where to live, and so on. So I see part of it to be a reflection of the type of environments that we are in, but at the same time, as individual people, oftentimes we have choices about which types of environments we put ourselves into. And so that's why, in large part, it's a reflection of both something that is like an enduring trait or personality of our own volition, and something that's also reflective of the culture at large.
So given that implicit biases are things that we're only dimly aware of, right? And so we can't even admit to ourselves, much less to others, how would you go about, measuring that?
Right, and so one of the challenges is that, almost by definition, you can't ask people about their implicit biases because they may not be aware about them, or are unwilling to talk about them. And so there have been kind of three different major types of approaches to try to capture these biases that people may not be aware of or that have trouble controlling. The first way that researchers figured out is just to run field experiments in the real world, where, for example, you might send 2 resumes to the exact same job, and the only thing that differs is the person's name at the top of the resume, whether it's someone who has a white-sounding name or someone whose name sounds more like the name of a black individual. And you can estimate the amount of subtle discrimination that's happening based on the likelihood of both of those resumes to get a call back for an interview. So that was kind of one of the first ways of trying to capture subtle discrimination in the real world, but those types of studies are really quite hard to set up and really quite intensive. So a kind of second approach that came around closer to the 80s and 90s was to kind of ask people indirectly on questionnaires by using some of that kind of subtle, almost dog whistling language and seeing if people endorse these subtle ways that we might talk about race without actually, saying that we hate another group.
So give me an example. Like, let's say anti-Asian. You can't ask, do you hate Asian people? Because they're not going to say yes, even if they do. I get it, because they don't even admit it to themselves. So there would be a subtle version of are you comfortable? Are you
so just to make up an example on the spot, you might ask them about things that would be indicative of someone who might have racist opinions, such as do you think Asian Americans can never really successfully assimilate into society, right? So trying to get at some of that kind of the subtle ways that we express hostility without saying that we just outright hate the group.
Got it.
And a lot of times when you look at how bias happens in terms of how people talk about it, it is kind of laundered through this kind of indirect language. But of course, one of the problems with that approach is that, well, sometimes you're just picking up on just unrelated beliefs or principled political positions that are not exactly the same as prejudice or bias.
Right, I might have some views maybe about immigration, right, for population reasons. Maybe some people think that's always racist, but maybe I think, no, I just don't want that much immigration. And maybe there's a less racist reason for that versus a more racist reason. And if you just ask me about immigration policy, it's maybe hard to distinguish between the policy preference and maybe my dislike of the kinds of people who might come through immigration, right?
Right, and that's kind of one of the really challenging parts, but clearly there's something that's going on there, but it's really hard to kind of separate it from the perspective of cold, hard statistics.
Got it.
And so the final approach, in some ways one of the most popular approaches these days, is to measure implicit bias using these kind of special cognitive tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these cognitive tasks look like kind of rudimentary, almost like lame video games, where, for example, the most popular one, the implicit association test, we measure your implicit biases by looking at how quickly you sort images and words to categories on the screen. And generally, you're faster at categorizing two things together if they're more closely linked together in our memories. And that's indicative of implicit biases in a fashion. There are a lot of kind of methodological issues with that as well. But what we can do from these three different approaches to understanding hidden or implicit bias is to get a sense of how it's happening overall, right? Through field experiments, through these kind of indirect questionnaires, and through these cognitive tasks that can measure it as well.
Got it. And I know that you played an incredibly important role with Project Implicit association tests, that Tony Greenwald and Majid Banaji and Brian Nozick have been so successfully associated with. And so there's I often call it just a fancy video game, a silly video game that people are playing where you're supposed to go as quickly as possible. And if you get different kinds of scores, depending on which way the keys and the stimuli are arranged, it shows you that there's an asymmetry, which is a little peculiar. Mm-hmm. So you've got audit tests, you've got kind of indirect questioning, and you've got video games. All right. So all right, I'll give it a go. So let's focus on video games because that's the kind of stuff that has gotten a lot of traction, although it's important to recognize that there are lots of different kinds of both video games and non-video game ways to measure this thing called implicit bias. But let's spend a little time on the video game approach, the IAT being an example. So we talked about this idea of implicit bias as something that we're dimly aware of. I kind of like that phrase, and it seems right. There's different ways to measure it. Let's pick one, the video game approach, say the IAT. what do these instruments demonstrate just generally? Like, how do people generally score on the video games? Because I think of myself in many ways, and it was recently Black History Month, and when we see the YouTube clips of Martin Luther King, dreaming of his children being judged by the content of character, not the color of skin, a lot of people say, look, I'm colorblind, I am with Martin Luther King. And that's how they're talking about colorblindness. So they think they treat white people, black people exactly the same, only on the merits. That's their explicit commitments to being a decent human being. Mm-hmm. I think that's widely shared. What do the video game scores suggest? Is that in fact what happens implicitly?
Right. So one of the surprising things is when you look at these, quote unquote video games, people tend to be faster. For example, on one about racial attitude, faster at categorizing white people and good things together, and compared to black people and good things together. And that's indicative of how these kind of mental associations in our head are engineered, right? Just as when I say the word peanut butter, you're much more
jelly.
You think jelly, right. Peanut butter jelly. It seems that it's faster for us to link together white people with good things than black people with good things, and that seems to be mostly independent of what your egalitarian commitments are. They're only kind of very weakly related, and so for many of us who have these kind of diverging patterns of results, there's a challenge there, right? Why are they so separate? What is going on within my mind that it looks like there are two different minds?
Wow.
And so that's what a lot of researchers have been trying to figure out over the past couple decades.
So you're saying this is even for people who are not trying to just fit in, sort of on the down low, be politically correct. They actually want to be fair and square. They actually do think that it's an important, explicit, normative commitment. Right? This is who they are. They want to treat people fair and square. Nevertheless, when they play these video games, they find evidence that it's just easier to sort good words with white faces over black faces.
Yes, and one of the things that they've tried to do is to figure out, it's explainable to like something else, right? Is it about something peculiar to how the tasks are? Is it a reflection of just that we like white objects relative to black objects? Does it matter if you use the word African American or Caucasian American? And so they've done all these variations, and the effect kind of holds, where across most groups in society, folks show this association. Faster at pairing white people with good things, black people with bad things. Slower at pairing black people with good things, white people with bad things.
And we know this is also true in lots of other things. It's not only white and black, it's young and old, straight and gay, abled versus disabled, thin versus overweight. Like, this is whatever you think the other average American has, or the average person has in terms of bias, is generally what we tend to see, right? We're higher status groups, and even if we disagree, higher status groups tend to actually be easier to sort with good words, right?
Mm-hmm. So the general pattern that we see across many of these different tests is that these implicit biases largely reflect, number one, whatever the kind of status hierarchy within society is, right? Which groups are better off, higher status, do better in society, and which ones do worse. And then secondly, they partially reflect our own personal group affiliations or personal experiences. So the one major group of folks that do not show these implicit racial biases favoring white folks on average are black folks. And for black folks, right, they have a whole other set of experiences because we live in a relatively segregated society where they're much more likely, for example, to have black friends, black family members, their own identification as someone who's black. That is a kind of countervailing set of positive experiences. Whereas if you're someone who identifies as white, your personal experiences are also going to push in a pro-white direction.
So we shouldn't be shocked that if you're a member of any team that you kind of like your team more, both explicitly and implicitly, right?
Yeah, although one thing I do want to emphasize in thinking about these results together is that it's not a complete mirror. It's not like black individuals have implicit pro-black biases that are of equal size to what we see with white individuals. Oftentimes when it comes to the majority or higher status group, they tend to show more preferences for their own group implicitly, Whereas when you're looking at whatever the kind of minority or subordinate groups are, while they might show bias for their own group, it's often to a smaller degree because they are also still living in the same culture and exposed to many of the same status hierarchies, which gets internalized.
So it's kind of like a superposition. You're just adding them because normally I would like my team, but if society constantly tells me my team sucks, then my like goes down, down, down. It might actually break to zero. It might even go negative, right?
Yeah. So like another way to think about it is like with majority group members, they're both kind of pushing in the same pro-majority direction.
Yeah. Good, better, yeah.
Yeah, minority group members, you're going to have that type of mental conflict.
Got it. All right, so this is depressing. Okay, now here's the last thing I want to do about implicit bias 101. So super interesting. We have this idea of dimly aware bias. We have various instruments, including fancy video games. We find like a whole mountain of data that's collected, frankly, at Project Implicit that shows essentially globally this kind of ways in which we kind of track existing status hierarchies. But in some sense, like what if I don't play video games? I don't really care about video games. I don't really care about who scores faster in some sorting game. If that kind of asymmetry in some reaction time measure doesn't really translate to real world behavior, then it might be interesting academically. I'm not sure how much it matters in the real world. So let's bring it to the real world. Is there a relationship between these measures of implicit or dimly aware attitudes and stereotypes and real world behavior? Like whom I hire, whom I fire, whom I give better medical care to, whom I shoot, under crises. That's really where the action's at. What evidence is there of that? Now, you did talk about all these audit studies before where you send two identical resumes, swap out Emily for Lakeisha or other kinds of things that we've seen. I guess that would be examples of discrimination, although, again, that didn't involve other measures, these kind of video game measures necessarily of bias. But tell me what the evidence of, again, it influencing real world behavior is, because that's where the action is, at least for lawyers.
Yeah, so I think a lot of that is kind of channeled through this question of how do we predict discrimination? It turns out it's incredibly hard to predict when someone will discriminate. But
Absolutely.
If
we only knew.
Right. And so it's a world in which we have a lot of things that just are very poor predictors. But in this world of poor predictors, we find that explicit bias predicts it a very tiny bit, and that implicit biases also predict discrimination as well, oftentimes a little bit better than their explicit bias counterparts at the individual level.
Okay,
On top,
can I just interrupt? Yeah. When you say explicit bias predicts only a little bit, so if I say I hate X people, that only predicts a little bit of my behavior towards those people?
Yeah, so this is one of these kind of surprising findings when you learn psychology that a lot of times we think of our actions as a reflection of our own personal attitudes.
Yes.
But it's not. That's only a little of what our behaviors are, just writ large, right? Our behavior is controlled by things that don't have anything to do with our personal opinions, for a large part, right? The type of job I'm stuck in, the type of social roles I have. Am I a parent? Am I a sibling? My read of what's normal to do. And so when you're thinking of all the things that contribute to a single particular action, your personal opinions are often only a small part of it.
Right. It could also be the situation, the environment, the choices I'm given, whatever's prime.
Right. Yeah.
Situation. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's why part of why discrimination is so hard to predict, because there's so many possible causes. But biases are one of the ones that are some of the larger predictors.
Okay, so even knowing, completely honest, as if there were a real polygraph, you could x-ray my brain and know exactly what my preferences are, even that only predicts actual discriminatory behavior a little bit. But if I heard you right, you said implicit biases, measured, again, maybe through a fancy video game, predict discriminatory behavior at least as well and even better than explicit?
In the studies that we have, and I think there's still a lot to kind of figure out exactly about what's going on and what types of implicit biases are relevant, right? Because if you're talking about, you might have one implicit bias that's about, say, race and criminality, but then you might also have another one that's about race and aggressiveness, and so you have all these individual implicit biases that potentially could add up into predicting more. But when you're talking about a single opinion often doesn't carry the day.
Okay, so if I want to poo-poo all this stuff and say, like, I know who I am, I know what my values are, I can control my actions, what you're telling me is that implicit measures, things that I'm maybe entirely clueless about or just dimly aware of, frankly repressed, I'm dimly aware of it, that might nevertheless influence my behavior towards other people just as much as kind of stuff I'm aware of.
Yeah, at least in terms of what they measure, that seems to be kind of what they are indicating, yeah.
Okay, so I should take it a little seriously. And this has been done like in real world domains? Like what? So, give me an example where I should scare me. Like where should I be worried about?
So some of the studies that I think are the most persuasive are ones where they combine the kind of audit study approach where they measure real world discrimination. Mm-hmm. They send out fake resumes to real hiring managers who may discriminate against them or not. And what the researchers did is they came back to these hiring managers a couple months later and had them take measures of implicit and explicit bias. So then you could then correlate their individual levels of implicit or explicit bias with whether or not they're likely to discriminate a couple months earlier. And they found that while explicit bias was not particularly predictive of whether or not they discriminated against minorities a couple months earlier, implicit biases were predictive.
This was like the work by Ruth out in Sweden. And
yeah, and they were particularly looking at a range of other groups, such as Muslim Arab folks and fat folks versus thin folks.
Interesting. Okay. That was Act 1. I think that was great. We have an understanding of what implicit bias is. We have an understanding of instruments and why they might actually matter. Because again, we certainly all care about explicit bias. If someone actually said during jury selection in voir dire, I think those people are always criminal or those people are more violent, like you get kicked off the jury. That's an explicit bias. You confess it, you're off the jury, right? Mm-hmm. If we take that seriously, then we should take implicit biases at least as seriously, you're suggesting, right?
Yeah.
If not more, maybe.
Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge in terms of thinking about how to incorporate that into legal practice because it breaks a lot of the kind of initial assumptions and premises over how bias happens.
Absolutely, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's go to Act 2. Act 2 is like solutions, right? Act 1 is bias, implicit bias 101. Act 2 is let's talk a little bit about solutions. So suppose, Calvin, I said to you, Calvin, you had me at hello. You had me at hello. I totally understand the implicit bias thing, big fan of your work, understand that it has consequences. I just want to fix the problem. I want to just get rid of implicit biases. You tell me I have dimly aware junk in my head. I've examined myself, meditated for many hours. I'm going to own some of it. I just want it out of my head, Get it out of my head. Tell me how. Calvin, tell me how.
So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there aren't that many well-known ways of doing it, right? I think that if you're thinking about what you can intentionally do, right, what you might be able to kind of intentionally commit to for a couple hours or a couple days is going to be a drop in the bucket of a lifetime experience that you've built. And so while I have personally tested and found interventions that could change some of these implicit biases and cut them by half within 5 minutes, what we see is that these implicit biases will often bounce back within a day or a couple days back to their baseline levels. And so there are two ways to kind of think about that. One is that, on the one hand, they are pretty malleable, right? They're rapidly adapting to whatever our local situation is. But on the other hand, right, that there is this kind of long-term stability. And the times where we are seeing something that looks like kind of long-term change in these implicit biases are situations in which you fundamentally change your environment such that you have different things coming in every day, right? That's maybe living in a community that's relatively less segregated, being assigned to a professor or a teacher that breaks or defies your stereotypes in some way, having a roommate that's of another race. All those are the types of kind of long-term chronic experiences that seem to kind of actually have a durable impact.
So you're telling me that there is no 5-minute short-term panacea, no 5-minute magical YouTube clip I can watch to scrub all the implicit biases away from my head. Because I know you know this because you did this in an elaborate, interesting study in 2014, right?
Right.
Where you had essentially a tournament of 18, I think, different techniques, each taking about 5 minutes to try to figure out which ones, if any, would actually change our video game scores. And some did create results. Like, can you give me one example that at least created temporary results for an hour?
Yeah. So the most effective one out of this field of 18, of which only 9 worked, which was kind of surprising to begin
Only
with.
9 out of 18 to begin
Yeah.
with. Okay.
We told
You're
them
depressing me. You're depressing me, but keep going.
Yeah, we told them submit the single most effective thing that you could think about, and so all of these experts in social
Super smart
psychology,
people, right?
Yeah.
The best people in the field. They put in their little like robot to compete against each other, and
Yeah.
what do they get?
And they had been published in some of the top scientific journals. Only half of them worked. And when we look at the one that worked the best, the one that could cut implicit bias by about 50% within 5-ish minutes, the researchers, what they did is they gave people an experience that might be the opposite of what they might see in an episode of CSI or Law
Is
and
this
Order.
the sadist one? Like the white sadist one?
Yes.
Oh,
So
tell people, it's awkward because you would never implement this in the real world, but people need to hear this.
I think it could be implementable. But basically, so what happens is you imagine yourself, walking home late at night, when suddenly out of nowhere, an evil white man comes and assaults you, throws you in a car trunk, and then drives away, and then he takes you out and continues assaulting you.
Oh.
When suddenly, a black hero, comes in, fights him off, saves the day, and you're
Denzel Washington arrives.
Yeah, right.
Equalizer 3. Yeah.
Yeah, and it sounds so outlandish in the abstract, but if you think about a lot of the media messages that we're getting every day, the types of TV shows that we watch, the types of Marvel superhero movies, we're often getting that in the other direction, right? When we're looking at Iron Man or Thor or
Black Panther, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, so I think that's kind of what they were getting at in terms of let's create this kind of really vivid, intensive media experience, and that's to cut implicit racial biases by half. Now, this was just 5 minutes. So it doesn't have to be so over the head if you have 2 hours with someone in a movie. But that seems to always show some of the mechanisms behind how these implicit biases change. It's just the sheer experience of something that defies your stereotypes.
Wild. So okay. So I guess how I can see how an incredible narrative storytelling that actually makes you feel like what it means to be again physically tortured or assaulted by a baddie will change my implicit attitude towards that group for the moment. But the bad news on this is that inside of certainly 24 hours, this stuff largely goes away. And in subsequent work, like in 2016, you demonstrated that with painful clarity.
Yes.
So am I hearing you right where you're saying that in some ways I can't scrub this junk out except for, you said, I guess, long-term engagements, right? So sometimes I say slow and steady wins the race, right? Are you saying the bias tracks were laid down? I'm 54, I'm almost 54 now. So for 54 years, those bias tracks were laid, although they were changed when I came to America. Different kinds of tracks were being laid down post my immigration. But is it going to take another 54 years to undo them? What are you talking about?
Yeah, so I think one of the things...
I'm not going to live that long, yeah.
Right. The mystery is what is going to work? And perhaps, one of the issues in terms of the types of interventions that we have tested, both in the lab and what often happens in the real world, is that we try to see if one powerful experience matters.
Huh.
And perhaps the kind of story that you might tell from findings like my own is that oftentimes it's not just the one experience, it's many experiences accumulating on top of each other over time, right? So, for example, if you're looking at the cultural level, we have seen actually a pretty dramatic sea change in both explicit and implicit attitudes about sexual orientation over the past 15 years that can coincide with a very visible difference in what the culture has looked like at large. And so while any single kind of media experience or exposure is unlikely to have this kind of long enduring effect, that kind of pitter-patter over hundreds or thousands of exposures over years might make a difference. So there's where I see some optimism, but I think it can be very frustrating if you are someone that is motivated to promote social justice to know that your one thing is just going to be one additional drop in the bucket.
Right, but then it does mean that it matters where I live. It matters whether I send my kids to a little bit more racially integrated school. It matters what kinds of the change in global media consumption patterns. It might all matter because it's just an everyday re-up of a slightly different conception of human beings doing slightly different roles that are different from what I earlier in my life had assumed. I'll tell you a story and you tell me whether you think there's anything to this. So I'm a law professor. When I started teaching, there weren't that many people who looked like me who were actually law teaching, it turns out. Odd, but true. I started teaching back in 1995. And in part because I do race work, a lot of my friends who are law professors are also people of color. When my daughter was born, and I had kind of dinner parties and friends over who were also law professors, she just assumed that law professors were people of color for most of her life, right? Until she realized, oh, that's a little unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that kind of, in some ways it's through her life, on and off, like she just sees people of color being law professors? Do you think that might have changed her implicit associations, or is the background noise saying, oh no, law looks this particular way, would have sort of drowned out all those individual experiences across dinner parties during her life?
Yeah, so I think that when we are looking at, entire lifetimes, right, those early experiences definitely do matter a lot, right, where, the fact that you have a lot of these kind of personal experiences that run against the grain of the larger culture are going to have an impact on your biases. What is not so well known yet, because we haven't had these kind of long-term studies that look at the same individual over, say, 20 years, is what happens when you do grow up, you learn more about the culture at large, and what happens when these things are kind of dueling out in your head. I think some of the existing theory would suggest that they will both end up mattering at the end of the day, and so while she might still show a bias to assume that professors are white people, it might be less than if someone, another child that grew up not having the type of experiences that she did.
Got it. They're all kind of, it's a push and pull. They're super
Right.
positioning. They're like waves that actually go on top of each other in different ways, and it's a constant fight. Okay, so I get it that there isn't going to be any short-term solution to debiasing, a 5-minute magic YouTube clip. I also get it that slow and steady might win the race, that long-term engagement, repeat play with countertypical examples are going to matter. It seems to make sense. That's how we learn the biases, that's how we might unlearn the biases or flip them. Then let's stop worrying about the junk in our heads. I just want, because I don't really want to police naughty neurons. That's not my goal. I don't really care about what might be glowing or where the blood might be flowing in an fMRI in some voxel in your head. What I really care about is stopping discrimination, right? So let's suppose I say, okay, the implicit bias game is going to take 30 years, take 20 years. We as a society will do it. We're going to change media, change integration, got it. But in the shorter term, I just want to stop the discrimination that is caused by dimly aware implicit biases. So how might we decouple or break the causal connection between implicit bias and mildly discriminatory behavior? What can we do then? There's got to be something.
Yeah, and so I think, if you think about this project as trying to change these implicit biases, in many ways it's kind of like a project of trying to, get people who are trying to diet to change their opinions about potato chips.
Love potato chips. Yeah. How do we do this? Yeah.
And usually, obviously in the dieting context, that's probably not the way that you want to go. You want to instead try to help people build good habits to work around the fact that they have these tendencies toward particular food, instead of just changing your, making people hate potato chips. That's kind of a non-starter.
Having like a white sadist eat potato chips while beating you,
right? Yeah, I think that in a similar fashion, if you were to think about this in terms of regulating these subtle biases, a more productive way right now is to think about how can we design our own lives, our social structures, our institutions, so that bias is less likely to kind of proliferate, right? How do we set it up so that we don't have to act on bias in the first place, so we work around it rather than trying to reduce it entirely, which seems to be an uphill battle.
Okay, so let's say I'm on board with that project. Let's say, okay, not my current job to try to scrub people's implicit biases. Maybe if you hang out with me, you'll end up liking Asian people more. Hopefully not dislike more, but whatever. I just want to create policies, procedures, practices, habits that make the implicit biases less relevant to the actual behavior and decisions we make. Okay, how do we do that? Because we have to exercise our judgments all the time. I'm a faculty member. People vote on whom to hire. They're trying to decide, oh, he's smart, but is he really smart? Mm-hmm. And when they're trying to answer the question, is he really smart? Is there some way to actually block that off of implicit preferences and group favoritism, all the subtle, almost aesthetic judgments we make about genius and super smarts? How could we do that?
Yeah, and so I think this is where a lot of the science of figuring out when implicit bias is especially likely to influence us really matters.
Okay.
And one of the things that we find in situations like that is that under conditions where you're making a choice and either the information is really complicated or hard to wrestle with, or your criteria for making a decision are really ambiguous, that's where you're going to more likely rely on your gut feeling. And where those gut feelings come from, well, a lot of times they're informed by your implicit biases. And so to combat something like that, it can be useful to think ahead of time before, for example, looking at candidates, to carefully go through and define what exactly counts as competence for this job, or what counts as qualified. So that way you let your values guide your decision making, rather than you seeing the candidates and letting your biases take the wheel.
So that sounds like a really sound practice, and I know the literature that says that, again, if you actually define your merit criteria ex ante and commit to them, then you're more likely to apply them. Otherwise, we'll just pick the guy that we like and construct a narrative that justifies it after the fact, either new criteria or changing the weightings of the criteria. And that's devastating, data that demonstrates how kind of motivated we are to justify, like, the guy we like, and I say guy advisedly because oftentimes it's a guy. Okay, I get that, but here's the rub, right? If you actually go anything besides, like, distinguishing one widget from another, if you actually go to a complex decision about evaluating performance, like hiring someone who's going to be your right-hand person, or deciding who's the genius for a full professor or an esteemed award, the truth is, writing out merit criteria, this should be 37%, this should be 28%, this should be on a 7-point scale, let's have a spreadsheet. Yeah, we say it, no one ever does it. Why? Because there seems to be something wrong with using a spreadsheet to guide such an important decision. It's like using a spreadsheet to decide whether you like Kandinsky versus Klee versus Picasso. Like, it just doesn't work. So I know people say we should guide our discretion by having criteria and weight it out and use rubrics and algorithms. But what do you say to the people who are like, yeah, but no, we're not going to do it, because that's just not what we do.
Right, and I think a lot of times, that's coming from a totally reasonable place, right? You set up the criteria in advance, you realize you didn't totally think it through, and there are other things that really mattered. Right? And so a lot of times I think of, when it comes to committing yourself to criteria, it's an iterative process, right? For those of us who have ever taught a class, you might have a rubric for grading essays. And the first time you grade the essays, it's like, okay, this isn't quite right because I didn't think about all the ways that students would have answered the essay prompt this way. So next time I'm going to make the rubric better. And I think we can think the same when it comes to a lot of hiring and promotion and evaluation processes, right? You iterate. You catch what you didn't quite get the first time and you improve the next time. The second is to not think of it as like that's the one thing you need to do, right? That there are that part of what the role of these kind of rubrics or pre-committing criteria does is it at least holds you to account, right? And it's one of multiple ways of holding you to account of like, well, if I'm going to deviate from what I said, I better have a dang good reason, right? I have to be able to justify it to myself. I have to justify it to the other people on the hiring committee. And so while all the times it might not be following it to a T, it's still kind of pushing you and challenging you to check your own biases. And so it can still be useful even if it's not followed, 100% of the time. Because, of course, there are going to be limitations to how well we can predict what a candidate pool might look like, for example.
Sure. So I like this idea, and often, of course, I do talk about accountability, and a rubric or a checklist or criteria committed beforehand is a form of self-accountability. There's other ways to get accountability. You could have, in the legal tradition, that if you know that there's an appellate court that's going to look at your work, then you as a trial court, you don't phone it in, right? Yeah. So if you know there's going to be people checking your work, even if it's an IRS audit, it's tax season. I mean, the IRS is underfunded. They're not going to audit anything these years, it looks like. But if you know your work is going to be audited, even if it's just a risk, then you might be a little bit more careful, right? Mm-hmm. And you could put on these accountability pressures yourself by committing to actually following certain things. And I like this idea that even if it's not perfect, even if it doesn't perfectly discipline your decision making, it forces you to explain to yourselves and to your fellow committee members on how and why you make the decision.
Yeah, and that reminds me of especially when we think about how when it comes to a lot of these major decisions like hiring, right? A lot of them, they happen in groups, and so you can take advantage of the fact that they're in groups to make sure that there are people who are kind of really trotting out differing sides and making sure that everyone's kind of checking against everyone else's reasoning, so that you're not kind of running wild with just your own biases without that type of group accountability.
Yeah, I like that, and I often say that there's a greater chance that the implicit biases will vector some towards zero when you have different kinds of people in the room, not all the same kinds of people who are going to be steering in all the same directions. All right, if there's one kind of solution strategy, and it might be just what we had talked about, if there's one solution strategy where someone says, look, I ain't got no time to read all these papers, Calvin's too smart, I don't understand what these meta-analyses are, I am willing to take up one strategy. I'm like a middle manager, upper middle manager, maybe I'm like a president of something. I'll take one strategy. Like what, if you got one strategy, what is it that you would pitch?
So the one strategy that I often recommend to folks that are coming from this position of not feeling like it's that important, or that it's not something that they need to worry about, is if that is really true, if you really are living up to egalitarian values, if you are really being fair to all of your stakeholders or employees or whoever you work with, then put yourself to the hard test. Go get some of the kind of organizational data that you have or your own personal data on how your organization is doing, whether that's hiring data, retention data, pay gaps, and see if you actually are as egalitarian as you think you are, right? Because if you are, then the data will show it. And if the data is showing that there are inequalities in your work practices or your organization, well, then now you have a problem that you need to fix, and you can tailor it to whatever that is.
Okay, so like I often use the analogy of a data mirror. Like if you think you're so pretty, then put the mirror to your face and just see. Like, do you have you're good looking, but you got some blemishes, and you got to own up to it. Now, here's the last question on this one. Here's the follow-up though. You don't actually know sometimes whether it's a blemish. So you do find disparities. Average pay between men and women, right? Or the rate of acceleration between men and women within a faculty. But underneath it all is always this anxiety, well, maybe they had different levels of merit. They seem to have different citations. They seem to have slightly different backgrounds. How do we control for everything? And even when you think you control for everything, is Harvard the same thing as, UCLA is the same thing as, WashU? Like, maybe they're all great, but there's a little difference. We can't really pick that up. So it's really merit that drives the differences. And that's why there's no discrimination. Disparity exists because we're a tournament of merit, and that merits are different. How do you respond to that?
So, I think that if an organization or executives or managers are asking themselves those questions, then they're already in a good spot, because they actually have to confront and provide a reason that they can sleep with at night, right? And one that they might be accountable to their subordinates, to their employees, to themselves, to the people around them. And so at least it starts the conversation. And even if not every time, they are taking some type of proactive moves based on some unjust inequality, you're at least now on a playing field where it is open for discussion, as opposed to just not looking under the rug and assuming it's not there. And so I think that type of transparency, while it's not necessarily going to get you to the best solution every time, you're at least now fighting or playing on a field where it is something that is up for discussion.
So I love this idea that transparency can create a certain kind of mutual accountability. None of this stuff is obviously a panacea, but as a pragmatist, which I am, and which I think much of your work reflects, it's always as compared to what.
Right.
And if it's better than what we have currently, we might as well do it. So so I gotta co-sign that. All right, that was Act 2, solutions. Whew. Act 3, let's talk about policing, something easy, right? You've done really interesting work on policing. Just to give you some props for grants that you received. You received important grants from the U.S. Department of Justice, from the Russell Sage Foundation, from you've worked with the Anti-Defamation League on thinking about what it is you can do with police officers in the form of essentially education that might actually make them, less discriminatory in all that they do, whether it's stops, whether it's violence, whether it's all kinds of things. And obviously policing is incredibly important. And I know from the talk you just gave to the faculty today that policing is one of those contexts where there's so much discretion, right? Like whom you stop for, going 3 miles over the speed limit, or running over a bump, or whether a taillight is out or not out. There's so much discretion every single day, oftentimes in the context of great physical fear, because there's a lot of guns in the world, right? And cops and police officers have to worry about that. That this is a place where implicit bias can really and maybe explicit stereotypes, frankly. But all of that stuff could really create a really challenging set of problems. So here's what I want to start with. Start with telling me how important do you think explicit versus implicit bias is in like policing? Like, do you have a view about what's more important than the other, or maybe you don't even think that bias is an important problem in policing? But give me a sense of how you see the whole problem space.
Yeah.
You got to be honest here.
Yeah. This is the first question that has really got me, because I definitely think that, relative to a lot of other professional sectors, explicit, blatant racism is alive and well within policing.
In the form of like hatred or like real contempt for groups, or just stereotypes. I think those people are more likely to commit fraud. Those people are more likely to have, marijuana on them. Those people are more likely, like that neighborhood tends to have more gunshots on the weekends. Like, I want to try to distinguish between like hatred and contempt kind of stuff versus just generalizations. Oh, that kind of car tends to speed more. Maybe I can't separate them, but like when you say explicit racism exists, like.
So I think both kinds, and they are mutually reinforcing. And I think on top of that, there's also the issue of implicit biases, and that the implicit biases are also kind of mutually reinforcing with the explicit ones. Now, explicit biases are also hard in their own right to kind of dislodge and reduce, but I think that relative to other industries, it can be relatively blatant with the types of practices that police forces and individual police officers, types of positions that they will endorse. So that is kind of one of the things that is really challenging in terms of like figuring out, how do we reduce bias in policing relative to like some of these other industries where the norms are going to be very different.
Got it. So, I've teased you sometimes saying that you're the harbinger of bad news because some of your work, again, has demonstrated that what we thought would reduce implicit biases didn't at all, or if they did, they lasted only for 24 hours. And even getting rid of implicit biases didn't seem to necessarily improve behavior all that much. I want to say you are the harbinger of bad news with police education as well, because in the paper that you just gave to this faculty, you demonstrate that on the one hand, there's some good things that come from educating police officers about the existence of implicit biases. Like, they get it, they understand the concept better, they believe it's a thing. But the punchline about changes in behavior, and I want you to, of course, describe it in your own words and how you measured it, seem not to actually move the ball that much or improve things. So describe a little bit about what you found from this work, sort of looking at the data with this kind of training that the ADL had done with police, and whether it's fair for me to call you a harbinger of bad news.
So my lab and I partnered with the Anti-Defamation League to see if a whole day-long training, about 8 hours in total.
8 hours.
Right, that's pretty intensive. Would kind of move the needle in terms of what police officers believed, what they're motivated to do, and whether or not they actually reported changing their behavior. And we found that this training was effective in kind of doing the most basic thing of making officers more aware and knowledgeable and buy into the idea that bias exists, right, and is a problem.
That's good news. That's good news, right?
And at least immediately, they were also concerned about it, not just in a kind of general abstract manner, but also, this is something that can apply to me, and I want to actually do something about it. However, when we went back to them 1 month later, there was not follow-through. Officers did not report doing some of the kind of evidence-based strategies for preventing bias to a greater degree than baseline. And they while they still bought into the idea that bias exists, they were less concerned about it for themselves, suggesting a kind of mixed picture. It's definitely changing what they believe, but it's not changing how they're acting.
That's bad news, right? So you are the harbinger of bad news.
Okay, well, glass half full, glass half empty, right? It is changing knowledge. It's not changing behavior. So, it depends on which one you want to pay more attention to.
Yeah, when you're on the wrong end of police violence, like it's the behavior.
Yes.
Right? So like that's the thing I'm concerned about. So were you shocked by these results, or you're like, I knew this all along. It's not going to do anything.
I was not.
Be honest.
I was not that surprised.
Okay.
I, as a professor myself that teaches regularly, I have a fiance who's also a high school teacher. We're both regular teachers, and so when we teach a great class or a great lecture, I often don't have many expectations that my students are going to remember it that well a semester from now. And I think that that's kind of the expectation that I came in terms of evaluating, do these diversity trainings, are they effective, right? You're oftentimes only giving them a day of experience, which is a drop in the bucket compared to, say, me teaching you a whole semester of social psychology. And so what we're seeing are gains that are kind of commensurate to how much you put in. 1 day of learning, 1 day of belief change, right? Maybe it will take much more than what we're currently doing to see actual bona fide change in a wide range of behaviors.
So I get that, but I also am a realist, not only a pragmatist, and I realize that, again, the idea that you could even get 8 hours of training or education into any busy professional group, police officers, academics, doctors, doesn't really matter, hedge fund managers, even getting 8 hours seems like a huge amount. If you think that somehow this has to be a recurring thing where you get an hour here, 45 minutes there, two hours there, a day retreat, and this is an annual kind of thing, a part of me thinks as a realist, that's really unlikely. So I'm a little concerned. Maybe there's some way to actually bake it in to the infrastructure such that we actually get to appreciate it more. A part of me is concerned. Here's my question, though. Is there some way to short circuit it? Like, what if I don't really, maybe I don't need to change hearts and minds of line level officers, line level, baristas, line level, even faculty. I don't need to change hearts and minds. I just need to change the way they do their work. Is there a way that I could change policies, procedures, practices, such that regardless of whether I've changed hearts and minds, they automatically do the right thing? Is there that approach?
So I see them less as oppositional, approaches as something that we ought to be thinking about symbiotically, right? You can have these kind of top-down policy changes, but if your rank and file aren't following through with them, if their hearts and minds haven't changed to want to comply with them, then you're still kind of where you started. And so I see the project of having a workforce or having a rank and file that want to be egalitarian and are motivated to kind of follow through some of these top-down policies, and having the top-down policies to support that, and having the incentives within an organization and the evaluation standards to reinforce some of these basic ideas of fairness and equity are important, right? And it can't just be one or the other. They have to work in concert, because the history of a lot of these types of reforms in policing and elsewhere are, well-intentioned, great ideas that fall apart when you rely on many individuals to actually reinforce and perpetuate these or propagate these policies.
So super interesting. So staying with policing, and maybe you probably have a better example than I can think of. So if it turns out that unlimited discretion leads to, again, differential stops and then violence, especially towards Black and brown men, it could be that a police, it could be that a police organization decides, what? For this kind of traffic offense, we're just not pulling people over. If you can get their license plate, so be it. We're just not pulling people over for this kind of. Who cares, right? It's not a safety concern. We're not doing it anymore, because every time there's a police to citizen interaction at nighttime under these circumstances, we know what the disparate results are. So we're just not going to do it, right? So we're going to take away your discretion to stop people for this kind of traffic offense. Full stop. If it's only 5 miles over, 10 miles over, we're not going to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
you could have police officers be pissed off at that. It's like, what is this? Like, come on, I have to do my job. I've got to, the city makes money when I do this anyway.
They might still have a quota that they need to comply to.
You're making my job harder. It's this PC nonsense. Why you're doing it? You're saying that if the police officers know that there's something called implicit bias and know that it has, again, differential consequences, even though they don't think of themselves as being explicitly biased, it might get police officers more in line with this policy change?
That's possible. I think I would say more generally that when you're thinking of implementing organizational change, you want the employees to really get it, right? To not just like do this because I have to, but to do it because they think it's the right thing to do, and that they think that the organization has their back in doing whatever that policy change is.
Got it.
And so that's where, and so part of that might be, I buy that I should have less discretion here because I know it's important to be fair and equitable. But if you implement this policy that cuts off some of this discretion that they really like, and you don't give them a good reason for why, then they might just decide not to follow it or become a little annoyed and go the other direction and maybe express some type of backlash and hunker down.
Yeah.
So I think that's how it's useful. I think particularly when it comes to how police departments, because there's so much local control, a lot of times it is down to these kind of individual personalities and subunits and unions and so on, and getting everyone on board.
Yeah, so it's less just an external, like, coercive measure and more of an internal motivation to do the right thing, at least an explanation that they can understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you need to have the supports.
Excellent. Okay, that was Act 3. We are done. You've been incredibly gracious, but I do have a few outro. If we had an intro, we're going to have an outro. I think that's what they call these things on YouTube, at least. We're going to have a little outro with a few questions. I think it's going to be 3 questions. Number 1. What's the most interesting thing you expect to happen over the next decade in your field of experimental social psychology and implicit bias? Is it like a new instrument, a new measure, a new intervention, like AI stuff, like county versus individual stuff, systemic versus implicit stuff? Like, what do you think is most exciting or potentially exciting over the next 10 years?
Yeah, so I think that within my field, for many decades, there has been this kind of gradual shift for psychologists to kind of look further and further down in terms of biology and neuroscience and so on. Mm-hmm. But there's now a kind of movement in the other direction of thinking about how the individual connects to these kind of societal, structural, and systemic factors. And so what I'm hoping for within my own little subfield is the development of interventions that really can kind of holistically think about how individual actions aggregate and are in conversation with these kind of systemic or structural forces. And I think that's ultimately where the future of developing good social reforms ought to be, right? Where we don't think of it as this or that, but we think of how systemic and individual forces can kind of work together.
Interesting. And of course, that would be very consistent with, again, many of the themes within critical race theory about what it means to, again, not stay locked in to just an individual perspective. Now, again, to go beyond a sort of explicit animus driven at the individual level, but to see, again, larger units of analysis at institutional and structural levels. Although I also think that understanding things implicitly is also another way to get beyond, again, this explicit animus orientation that the law historically has understood to be most bias. Super cool. 2 more questions. Second, what keeps you up at night? I don't mean, do you have a crying kid in the background? I don't mean that. I don't mean even the pandemic stuff. Like, what keeps you up at night about your discipline, about your field, maybe about racial justice, about the relationship between these kinds of questions that you're exploring, implicit bias and the nature of our democracy and politics? Is there anything that you're really kind of scared about?
Yeah, so I think that we have been moving over the past couple of years to in what to me feels like a relatively like new era of how we talk about race in America, right? Where white supremacist forces have become relatively more empowered and out in the open. And on the leftist side of things, right, that there is more talk again of things like reparations and things that are much more race conscious than, say, the Democrats of 15 years ago. And I see that as both real opportunity, right? Because rather than just talking about race in this kind of really subtle or indirect way, that people are talking about what's at stake in a much more concrete fashion than they were before. But at the same time, I do worry about how these things might kind of entrench themselves, right? If we are to have a type of national politics that is purely defined in terms of white folks versus non-white folks, right? What could kind of come out of that in terms of unintended consequences? And so it feels both to me like, great, we might see a lot of social change in the coming decades, but in what direction, I don't know.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of polarization and
Yeah.
a lack of trust, especially when we don't agree on values and frankly don't agree on facts or even the possibility of facts.
Yes.
Where everything is called fake.
And some of the thing that brings me some of the most worry in a very concrete manner is the kind of activation of white identity and the realization of white individuals as a kind of like having to kind of watch out for themselves in a way that
Sure.
if you were growing up in the 90s, early 2000s, like a lot of times the kind of discourse is that we were past that.
Yes,
right?
yes,
So,
we're not past that. And
yeah.
every time there's a survey or every time there's something on the news about, demographics are changing, whites are becoming a minority, of course, that activates all the psychological defensive mechanisms that actually underscore the strength of that identity. Third question, and you kind of answered it, but I want to give you a chance to actually give a more complete answer. Like, what gives you hope? I take you as being like oddly optimistic. Like you're often smiling. You're high energy. Even though a lot of your research says like this stuff's really hard. Like things don't change and things don't work. And we thought it might, but let's be honest. Like some half empty, but half full, but also half empty. What gives you hope in doing this kind of work?
So I mean, I think having been in the field now for, depending on how you count, around 12 to 15 years, I feel like I've already seen a lot of change in my time in the field, and some of the things that I find really quite promising are just that first off, that discussion about what doesn't work has become a much larger part of the discourse in terms of thinking about social reforms. Science oftentimes is a little bit biased toward here are the things that do work, and that gives us a kind of warped perception of what types of reforms might make sense. Because part of understanding what works also means that you need to know what doesn't work. And I think social science has been more open to thinking about these kind of null effects or non-effects as well over time. A second thing that I find a lot of promise in it is this kind of active, more race-conscious discussion about race that wasn't really present when you're thinking of in as much of the same degree in the Obama era or so on. And I think that really kind of opens up the space for the types of social reforms that are needed to reduce racial inequality and other forms of social inequality within this country, right? Like if you can't talk about inequality
or teach about it,
right, in the open, like then how can we possibly think to address the issue? And so of course that comes with its own risks. Yeah. But I think that also seems to me like a large opportunity, right? That we are thinking about inequality full stop instead of engaging this kind of subterfuge or indirect speak about it.
Well, Calvin Lai, you've been amazing and gracious with your time. Thank you for talking with us about these incredibly important issues and your important research. We appreciate it, and we have reasons to hope, even as we have reasons to worry about those things that keep us up at night. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.